It's lovely to see so many familiar names, some of whom I haven't seen in person for a very, very long time. So, yeah, just to let you know, St. Antony's is thriving. We're coming out of the pandemic. Activity is picking up. If you haven't been to the college recently, please come and see us soon, because the re-landscaped lawn has got students sitting out there just like we always dreamed would be the case, enjoying the sun. I don't know how much they're enjoying revising for exams, which they're going to have to start in about a week or so. Some of them are looking for their sub-fusk so they can get ready to go down to the examination schools. But life is returning to normal, and we've had some fabulous in-person seminars. We had Lord George Robertson, former head of NATO, was here on Tuesday. Very large audience talking about his negotiations with Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s about the enlargement of NATO, and telling us the conversations they had then and how they differ to the conversations that are going on now. It was a very typical St. Antony's type of event. So lovely to see you all. Lovely to report that all is well in the college, and lovely to introduce two, I was going to say old, they're not old, they're young, but long-standing friends of the college, both of whom were roughly the same cohort. So Dimitar it says you did your DPhil in 2001. Is that the date you started or the date you finished?
That's the day I started, but I
Good.
came
I
here
thought
before.
so. I was just checking. That's what I thought. And Kerem, I think you were exactly the same cohort. I think you two both started at roughly the same time. Dimitar, I know you were in international relations, and Kerem, I've just checked, you were in human geography. And Dimitar, of course, is going to talk today about his latest book, Turkey under Erdogan. Kerem, I think you'll introduce a little bit about Dimitar's academic work, but just to say, for those of you who don't know, he is, of course, the program director currently at the European, which I'm thrilled and delighted is actually now attached to St. Antony's College. He's a lecturer in the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and also a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, and the region head for Eastern Europe at Oxford Analytica, as well as, these are a number of roles simultaneously, research director and founder of the European Policy Institute in Sofia. And for reasons that I don't know, he's currently talking to us from Berlin, but maybe he can tell us at one point why he's currently in Berlin. And his book that we're going to hear about, of course, traces the path away from the democratic aspirations and pro-West sympathies that have prevailed prior to 2002 in Turkey. There was a fabulous review. I hope you weren't going to also read this, Kerem, in the Financial Times last week, which said a particular strength of this book is that it does not attribute Turkey's turn from democracy exclusively to Erdogan, but emphasizes the authoritarian legacies shaping the state. That seems to me to be the mark of a real high quality academic book, and I know that's exactly what you have produced. Kerem is currently at Ca' Foscari in Venice. So I was complaining, one of our colleagues is in Venice and the other one is in Berlin, two of my favorite European cities. And he works on the intersections between global constellations of power, domestic political processes, and contested identity and historical memory, the classic area for geographers to work in. He's particularly intrigued by how transnational connections constitute local politics and identities. You're almost an anthropologist. And his primary empirical case study, of course, has been for many years Turkey. So let me hand over to you, Kerem. Thank you very much for taking the time out to introduce Dimitar, and Dimitar to introduce his book. Thank you to both of you very, very much indeed.
Thank you, Roger. It's a great pleasure, and to Wouter as well. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back at St. Antony's, if only online. I'm coming in 2 weeks though, for the anniversary of CSOX, but for now it's only online. But my pleasure is even greater as I'm tasked to introduce and discuss the work of a dear friend and colleague, Dimitar. I've known Dimitar since we both arrived at St. Antony's in 2000. So we arrived in 2000, I did a master's, and then we started PhDs in different programs. So it's more than 20 years. And while preparing for today, I was somewhat taken aback by this very long period of time that has passed ever since. But, you know, such is life. We were both involved in the work of CSOX, Southeast European Studies at Oxford, which, as I said, is celebrating. And this is, I think, also where Dimitar's scholarly work started to take momentum, with books and publications on the history and politics of Macedonia, the Mediterranean, Southeast Europe, his DPhil, of course, constructing Southeast Europe on Balkan regional integration, and then his more recent book on Russia in Southeast Europe as a rival power to the EU and Russia and the US. Now, considering this both regional and intellectual trajectory, it was almost inevitable that he would eventually write a book on Turkey. But I believe there are deeper reasons for this particular engagement with Turkey as well. During our late bar get-togethers in those years, and there were many, I was in fact impressed by his intimate knowledge of things Turkish, also of the Turkish language, and I won't go into more detail here, but by his clear understanding of the linguistic, cultural, and gastronomic connectivities in this part of the world. And this is something I also benefited a lot in my own work from. So Bulgaria and Turkey are, of course, I mean, not two countries where there's much love lost, but also not much hatred. So it's a very different case from the Greek-Turkish relationship. But these are probably the only two countries where rakı and ayran compete for the label of the best loved national drink. And I didn't make this up. I mean, I knew it anyway, but I've also confirmed it after some internet research on the website Kashkaval Tourist, which has a list of these drinks. Anyways, so it is this rich and, culturally informed, unique perspective which Dimitar brings to the study of Turkey and its political fortunes, and more recently its misfortunes, of course. I think his approach disentangles the interdependencies between international and domestic politics, which I think is the most important, like epistemological success of this book. He has a profound understanding of the many geopolitical regions which intersect in Turkey, and whose political imperatives sometimes pull the country apart. He has an intimate insight, but he also has sufficient distance to the subject matter. So it's the internal-external perspective, which also, which gives him both intimacy, but at the same time, some, distance, which protects him from a partisan position, and a sympathy, if not for the people in power, but for the people in Turkey, I think. And this is quite important, I would say. So these qualities make the book Turkey under Erdogan a very important one for me and for anyone working on Turkey and the region, of course. And he discusses basically how Turkey turned away from democracy and from this hopeful EU candidate status, which shaped very much the first years we were in Oxford together. So how it turned away from the West, but as we see, it's not turning away completely. It's still there, and there's a space of opportunities which we are now seeing unfold. So with this, I would like to give the floor to Dimitar. Please, the floor is yours, Dimitar.
Thank you, Kerem. I could have hoped for a more generous introduction, and this is only right and proper to thank you as well for your friendship and support and all I've learned over all those years. Of course, there are many stories to be shared and not to be shared going back to St. Antony's, but let me start with one just to set the scene of what drove me and what experiences eventually fed into the book. It was, I think, May 2004. And CSOX then hosted a conference which was looking at Turkey's relationship with the EU. That was all the rage at the time, with people debating the EU ambitions and the relatively new government that was in charge in Turkey. So the keynote lecture at the time was given by one Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who came to grace us as the main headliner of the event. I mean, the keynote didn't happen at St. Antony's. We went to St. John's. I don't know what the politics behind this was. But that was my first encounter with the subject of the book, although just to steal my thunder, it's not an Erdogan book, really. It's about Turkey as a whole. But the point is that in 2004, Erdogan was everything that was hopeful about Turkey. He was a politician who was confident, had the popular mandate, had the right messages. I mean, he talked about how important he is for Turkey, not just because of membership, but also because of democracy in Turkey. He talked extensively about the Kurdish issue, how Turkey was committed to tackle this festering wound that to this day, unfortunately, is poisoning society and politics. And I remember him flanked by our friend Calypso Nicolidis on one side, and on the other side, the late great Jeffrey Lewis, who of course made a major contribution to the study of Turkish language, but also the history and politics of Turkish language at Oxford. And we were all starry-eyed, and Erdogan was at his best, projecting confidence, and there was some sort of chemistry going on, to the extent that even Calypso borrowed a line from Kerem. This is famous arabesque song by a Turkish singer that he didn't have the opportunity to go to Oxford because there was no Oxford. So it was all love around. And then fast forward to 2016, I think that was one of my more recent encounters with Erdogan. I was in Istanbul in October, and that was right after the coup, and all the repressions are picking up momentum. But more importantly, that was when Vladimir Putin came to town. That's my first and only meeting with Putin, although I was one amongst 3,000 other people in the Congress Center. It was all about energy, but it was a sign of support by the Russians to Erdogan. And it was not just the two strong men in the audience. It was almost like who is who in the world of authoritarian politics. You had Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, you have Ilham Aliyev from Azerbaijan, and of course the master of ceremony was the son-in-law of Erdogan, who was the up-and-coming, at the time, possible successor. It didn't turn out like that, but and it was a very different Erdogan, who basically wanted to be seen in the company of fellow strongmen. He had survived this existential threat to his rule, and he was decisively pushing an agenda of grabbing even more power, and obviously looking towards changing the political system, overhauling the constitution, building a strongman presidential regime, and not rubbing shoulders with the Western politicians, but with all those other people who's sort of casually would dismiss America as the supreme evil and shut down the European Union. So the big question is what happened in the intervening years? What went wrong in Turkey and why it is the case? But also towards the end, to gaze in the crystal ball and say a few words about what is likely to happen in another 20 years. And of course, I might be completely mistaken in whatever my speculations about the future. So there are two issues about what went wrong. One is, like Kerem said, domestic, and the other foreign policy related. And just to open the parenthesis, initially when I approached Yale University Press, I offered the book on foreign policy because that's my field. But the editor at the time, funnily enough, she shared a name with Erdogan. Her name was Taiba, a British lady of South Asian origin. She said, no, if you want to do something, it has to be 360 degrees. You have to cover the domestic. And she was right in hindsight. It just made my life more complicated to synthesize all that had happened. So basically, yeah, I mean, my response is what Tony Barber picked in Financial Times. Erdogan is to blame. He has an authoritarian personality. And at some point, he decided that he needed to cling to power no matter what. We can discuss what was the turning point. Was it 2008 when there was a court case by the Constitutional Court to close the AKP? Was it Gezi Park in 2013 when he actually severed his links with the liberal intelligentsia, our friends who had supported him and who now are paying the price? Just to add another footnote, I mean, many of those stories that Kerem mentioned that convey a sense of sympathy, I mean, they have a strongly personal dimension. One of the people who contributed a chapter to edited volume I produced in 2011, just before Erdogan won power for a third time, Hakan Altınay, has now been sentenced to what is 18 years in jail under the case against Osman Kavala, another great individual whom I had a chance to talk to in those relatively more hopeful days. So Hakan now is facing, 2 decades in prison unless the appeal reduces the sentence. But it's totally unjust. It is he didn't do anything, let alone plotting to subvert the government. Yeah, I mean, what was the moment when Erdogan decided to grab power and to shed all those vestiges of pluralism and commitment to democracy? That's up to debate. But we know that by the time, by the mid 2010s, it was the next phase. Now, but what I want to argue is that it's not only about his strategies, and I don't. To put my cards on the table, I don't believe that from day one he had a master plan. He adapted to circumstances as we went along. And maybe it's only right and proper to reference here something that Kerem co-edited, a collection of articles for a special issue on exit from democracy, where he actually pushed the argument that AKP, the ruling party, faced this existential crisis and it changed strategy. So Erdogan did adapt, but also he had long-term forces at play. Certainly polarization in politics played a role. Early in the game, Erdogan sought to build a coalition of various forces under the banner of EU membership, where you had the liberals, part of the leftists, the Kurds, certainly one way or the other, also business supporting him. But later on, more and more he sought polarization as his strategy of choice, using the populist argument of the people against elites. But he didn't invent polarization, it was there. So that's a long-term factor. Another long-term factor that is worth discussing is nationalism. And for those of you who study Turkey or you follow Turkish politics, you certainly know that nationalism comes in different flavors. In Turkey, there is a secularist version of it. But we discovered that there's always been an Islamist version, a conservative tinged version. And ultimately, once the European Union membership perspective was out, and when Erdogan especially didn't succeed in forging a coalition with the Kurds after 2013, nationalism became a strategy of choice and helped him reach out to the Nationalist Action Party, the far right in Turkey. But nationalism was always a winning card, always an option out there. And that's something that very much reflects longer-term Turkish trends in Turkish history to do with state building and so on and so forth. But also, last thing to remember is the external anchor, which I sort of hinted at, that as long as the EU perspective was there, you could sustain some democratic momentum, right? When towards the end of this hopeful decade, the 2000s, you started seeing pushback, not just because of the Cyprus issue, but also Sarkozy coming to power in France. And I think that was a turning point. The EU anchor stopped applying. Now, I remember the discussions, not so much within academia, but within policy at the time. Around 2010, 2011, the tenor was, look, the EU was needed at the beginning because it provided the initial push. but then Turkey has enough internal momentum. It doesn't need Europe anymore. It can continue democratizing by itself. What we discovered, that was not the case, certainly, because also Erdogan changed strategy. Realignments in Turkish politics started appearing, and some of the cracks pushing polarization became even deeper. So this is kind of a very sketchy version of my argument. And again, this is not a strictly academic book, it's a descriptive book, it's a synthesis. It's a narrative, not a work of political science. But if I want to flesh out some arguments, these would be the structural forces at play that I highlight through the narrative. Now, the second issue I'm highlighting in the book has to do with Turkish foreign policy, what happened there. When Kerem was at the late bar, he very much was a personification of this new vision of Turkish foreign policy, because not just me or our big friends clustering around him. He had lots of people from the Middle East as well. So he was sort of the hub. And that's what Turkish foreign policy became over time, right? I mean, Turkey reinvented itself from being on the periphery of the West to the center of its own world, building on history, shared geography and cultural connections, to start developing links to all neighbors. Ahmet Davutoğlu, who of course came as a keynote speaker to a conference CSOX organized in 2010, sort of fleshed out that in his work and his speeches. But like I said, Kerem was doing it on a small scale, even before he did. But on a more serious note, this trend in Turkish foreign policy didn't start with the AKP. It was already there under a person called Turgut Özal. And if you read the book, you'll see that he's probably a central figure in my narrative as Erdogan, at least in the early chapters. And also later in the 1990s, people of the secularist camp, like Ismail Cem, who again was involved in setting up CSOX, also advocated a similar foreign policy. So Turkish foreign policy and conception of the world evolved. The failure of the EU to deliver on expectations reinforced this trend, but it was already there. I want to argue it's not about the AKP per se. Now, the other thing in the book that happens is that there was a awakening of sorts, because at some point there was hubris in Turkish foreign policy. We are so important, so successful, such strong militarily, democratic achievements, the economy is booming. We can remake the Middle East, but maybe other neighboring regions in our image. When the Arab Spring happened, that was the peak of this understanding. But reality was very different, and the war in Syria was a wake-up call. The sort of pushback against Turkey. And that was a tragedy, of course. I'm trying to tell the story in relatively neutral terms, but you have to be cognizant of the hundreds of thousands of people who lost their lives and or displaced in the process. Turkey suffered a defeat of sorts with the Iranians and then the Russians stepping into the fray. It became sort of victim of circumstances, with like almost 4 million Syrians living within its borders. So instead of Turkey reshaping the region, it was the region reshaping Turkey. And now xenophobia and the backlash against refugees is such a central theme in Turkish domestic politics. So that's something that the book discusses. The other thing is that also Turkey sought under Erdogan to position itself as an independent player in between the West and the East. And that's, I'm sure, something we'll be discussing this in the Q&A. On the one hand, the US, on the other hand, Russia. You had the rapprochement with the Russians. Turkey didn't align itself, or hasn't aligned with either party. And now that's evident in Ukraine, but trying to do business with both and maximize its gain. Sometimes that works. sometimes it doesn't work that much. But the vision is there, and it's likely to survive this regime, to persist in the future, with Turkey as the power in the middle, trying to play the East versus West, and so on and so forth. Finally, two thoughts about the future. The first one is that, as Kerem said, the title is somewhat misleading, because I don't think Turkey abandoned the West altogether. It's part of NATO. Also, if you look at the Turkish economy, the European Union is so essential. In actual fact, I'm right now sitting in the middle of Berlin, and if I go out in the street, I'm very likely to hear Turkish spoken around the city, and it epitomizes the centrality of the German-Turkish relationship. And more so, I mean, now we have elections coming up in Turkey next year, and I'm sure Erdogan will become trying to get votes from diaspora communities, especially in a neck-to-neck competition where every person counts. The Turks or Turkish citizens living in Western Europe will be very key to his success or failures, which will highlight the interdependence and the interpenetration, if you will, of Turkish domestic politics and the domestic politics of key Western European countries. So this is to bear in mind, that whatever rhetoric suggests about Turkey being independent, divorcing from the West, they're societal, economic, and human realities that sustain this connection. And it need not be a binary choice whether you're in the Middle East or you are in Europe. You can be both, sort of thing. So that's number one. My number two contention is that Turkey is likely to recover some of its democracy beyond Erdogan's tenure. What we've seen over the past years is resilience. Resilience. I mean, compare Russia and Turkey. Can you imagine the Russian opposition, to the extent that one exists, capturing the large cities in Russia? That's inconceivable. Or Egypt or Azerbaijan or any other authoritarian regime. After all, we have 7 decades of relatively free and fair elections. We have civil society that has remained in place despite all the crackdowns and repressions. And most importantly, we have opposition that has learned to play the game. And it's not a fair game, it's not a level playing field, but they're doing the most. And longer term, this regime will find difficult to pass the baton once Erdogan is out of the scene. There is no successor. It's a personalistic system, holding our institutions. So I'm not concerned about the longer term, but of course we live in the short term, and that's what matters. And unfortunately, we'll see much more turbulence, especially in the crucial election year, because Erdogan cannot afford to step down. He has 2 exit options. One is to go into exile. The other one is probably to go to jail. So the stakes are very high for him, and he'll remain in power no matter what. So yeah, I mean, in 20 years' time, Turkey will probably be back to its old self, which is a messy democracy with lots of contentious issues, with lots of polarization and tension within society. But it won't be a one-man show that we've seen now. And that's sort of the silver lining in this book. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to the question. And I'm seeing that lots of people are reacting there.
Thank you, Dimitar, for this really deep, well, not synopsis, but discussion of some of the main points in your book. I was actually following the chat, and you know, there were no questions coming in, so I wrote this reminder. 5 minutes, nothing happened, and now it's exploding. And you know, it's very much the St. Antony's culture coming through there. I still try to start with one question and then immediately open it up to discussion. What struck me was that you didn't use the term Islamism or political Islam in this presentation. And when we look at Turkish foreign policy, we see a lot of different layers or different images which come to mind. You have like this almost ummatic Islamism, but you have also regional middle power behavior. You have strongman politics. You have a trading state. Could you kind of disentangle this a little bit for us?
That's a big question, and mea culpa for not jumping into the whole Islam thing. I mean, there are people who suggest that Erdogan's Islamism is instrumental, right? You use it as a way to mobilize support domestically, but also as a foreign policy tool. I think that's exaggerated. There's some genuine ideological bias in Turkish foreign policy under the AKP. The whole conception of what Turkey wants to be, a leader of global Sunnis. I mean, you've seen it as Turkey engaging in Somalia, for instance, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, or Erdogan going to Sarajevo and staking a claim to be the leader of Balkan Muslims. So this is a strong theme in Turkish foreign policy. I would say that it was there before, but Turkey, the secular elites were cautious about using it, whereas the AKP is unabashedly committed to it, and it's put it at the center of how they conceive of both Turkish foreign policy, but also Turkish national identity. So it's not instrumental, it is genuine. But having said that, very often you have to make a choice, right? And this is where your question comes in. If you have to choose between Islamic solidarity or your ambition to be leader of Muslims in Europe and worldwide versus raison d'etat, it's very often that ideology takes the backstage. And it's very much evident in the relationship between Turkey and China, for instance. In 2009, Erdogan bashed China over the mistreatment of Uyghurs. And this is a group which is also Turkic. It's not just Islam, which is the connection. It's also Turkishness and Turkic solidarity at play. But these days, he's been very soft-spoken. So the Xinjiang never appears as an irritant in China-Turkey relations. And then you see a very clear example. Also, there are plentiful examples with Russia. In the 1990s, during the first Chechen war, Turkey was very outspoken under Tansu Çiller about the Chechens. And later on, of course, starting not with Erdogan, but with Ecevit, almost Turkey gave a free pass to Russia in the second Chechen war. But even now, there's not much by way of holding Russia accountable to what it does to Muslims, how it treats Muslim minorities. So great power politics trumps Islam in Turkish foreign policy. And that's why I think you should start first from other factors before you get to the raw of ideology, which of course is there.
Okay, great, thank you. Now as I said, the questions are pouring in, and they're basically in three big groups. We have questions about foreign policy, current foreign policy, about current domestic policies, and then a whole complex of questions on Turkey after Erdogan, how Erdogan will go, or will he go, and what will he do next, and how will Turkey look like after Erdogan. So I suggest we start first with the foreign policy questions, because we've discussed this quite a lot, and there we have obviously a lot of questions on the Swedish and Finnish NATO bids. Mirena Pencheva, for instance, asked, when it comes to Turkish foreign policy, how do you see Turkey's position on the Swedish and Finnish NATO bids, and also on Russia and the war in Ukraine? Pekka Pere also has a question trying to understand why Erdogan has shifted. Apparently there was no such opposition initially, but it has been has really exploded more recently. So he asks for these changes. A comparable question also comes from Laszlo Serences, a PhD student of mine. So hello, Laszlo. He asks, how do you see Turkey's relations with the West in light of Erdogan's balancing act in Ukraine. So basically, Ukraine, Finland, Sweden, NATO, what can you tell us?
Yeah, this is a whole lot of questions, certainly. I have no inside knowledge, and I cannot read Erdogan's mind. But my first reaction when I saw the statement was that he's engaging in horse trading, setting a hard position and then trying to bargain and get some concessions on other things. And that might be mistaken. I have no evidence either way. What I saw later, I mean, the day after, is Ibrahim Kalın, his advisor and one of the sort of smarter people around Erdogan these days, in this narrow circle of people shaping Turkish policy, trying to soften it, walk back a little bit, that we have our concerns, but we are not against Swedish and Finnish membership. Now, the latest I read this, that they're trying to operationalize some demands, saying that Sweden negotiated with the YPG in Syria. But, I mean, Turkey itself was talking to YPG in the old days. I don't see this one. In fact, I was once in a room with Salih Muslim of the PYD in London, and we had Turkish diplomats. So that was when the Kurdish peace process was still going, and they were not on friendly terms. There was some tension, but they engaged in polite conversation. So this one cannot be the main concern. They might have some demands to do with PKK support in Sweden, but I don't really know. You cannot fail but see also the contrast. It's not about Sweden, but Scandinavian countries as well, because of course in the good old days, the Norwegians hosted track 2 negotiations between the PKK. That's not even the offshoots, it's the real PKK and the Turkish government. The National Intelligence Organization was sitting in Oslo talking to the PKK. So I hope there is some rational policy there, trying to squeeze out something. But I'm afraid it might be the other thing, just emotional outbursts. So Erdogan does something, and then his people are trying to sort of channel it into a more productive direction. And it might come to hurt Turkey, because Sweden and Finland probably will join, even if there's no NATO membership in the short term, because Turkey is obstructionist. You've seen the UK giving bilateral guarantees to Sweden. I'm sure the US can do the same, and they get the benefit of alliance even without being in NATO right away. So Turkish leverage is not as extensive, but then this creates bad momentum in core NATO countries, first and foremost the US, where Congress has been divided on a Turkish demand to upgrade the Turkish Air Force with F-16. And the Biden administration wants to cooperate with Turkey, because Turkey is doing a lot of useful things in Ukraine, supporting the Ukrainians. But then again, Erdogan comes in and he makes a statement, and he poisons the relationship. And just to jump to what Laszlo asked, I think the next year will be quite turbulent, again, because of domestic politics and foreign policy and domestic cross-pollinating one another and creating a vicious circle, more like. Just imagine a situation similar to 2017, 2018, where actually AKP senior members want to campaign in Netherlands or in Germany or in Austria to get votes, and then for whatever reason local authorities say no, and then Erdogan uses that to whip up nationalist sentiment, to say those Western governments hypocritical, they don't want us, they want to undermine Turkey. That will create the sort of acrimony that you saw 5 years ago around the referendum and the elections. So yeah, the return to the West will be tactical, based on common interests, but there will always be the Erdogan factor, and domestic politics poisoning those relationships. I'm afraid, and what we've seen with Finland and Sweden is very likely the flavor we are going to see in the observable future.
Yes, I think the domestic politics factor here is really important. I mean, and the larger project also of necessity of regime maintenance, which probably pushes him to these grand acts, which we then have big problems in explaining. Thank you so much for that, and maybe we can move to the questions on domestic policy or domestic politics. I mean, you said that your editor asked you to give the great view and have both international foreign policy and domestic politics, and hence also the questions asked for the great view. So one is about the Kavala case and the European Courts of Human Rights, which has ordered, of course, the release of Kavala, but it has been refused. Do you think that, I mean, at the moment there is a suspension looming, but the question from Kaveh Musa is, will there be an expulsion from the Council of Europe, and what kind of consequences would that have for Turkey, which would also kind of take it in a position like Russia at the moment, who basically withdrew. And there's a question from Vivian Nürnberg on minorities. How do you see the future of the political participation of minorities in Turkey, such as Kurds, but also Alevis?
These are big questions. And I mean, when it comes to domestic affairs, I'm humbled by some of the people in the audience. I see Professor Kılıçdaroğlu, who was one of the scholars who came to St. Antony's over those years on a visiting scheme. And I certainly learned a lot from him, from Ali Çarkoğlu, from Soyoza, and others who were there. I don't know. I mean, expulsion from the Council of Europe probably is a realistic prospect. But if I was Erdogan, I'll do my usual spiel. You say this is a foreign plot against Turkey. Everyone hates us. The West hates us, and therefore we should stick together. It's not about me or about my policy. It's about Turkey, and they have a problem with Muslims. They have a problem with Turks. It will be something along those lines. The response. So it won't help. I hope that Turkey stays in the Council. I mean, it's a difficult one to crack, because if you stay in the Council of Europe, then Turkish citizens have access to the court and can take the state to court. And many of those cases have been critical domestically. Anything to do with the headscarf in the past, also the Kurdish issue, there are landmark cases about Turkey. There's a rationale to keep Turkey in, but I see the logic the other way around, that, I mean, at some point you have to do something. Maybe expulsion or suspension is the way forward. And there's no good solution there, I'm afraid. On minorities in Turkish politics, I think Kurds are essential, and we have all kinds of Kurds, of course. There's no one community. I mean, and there will be Kurds voting for the AKP no matter what. But if you narrow down the question to the HDP, the People's Democracy Party, you cannot understate how important it is, because the wins in Istanbul and Ankara were down to their voters, right? Now we have six parties uniting in a coalition pre-election. But there's a seventh member of this coalition, and nobody wants to make it public. It's the HDP. So they'll be the kingmaker one way or the other. Anybody who wants to challenge Erdogan needs those votes. But of course, Erdogan will probably try to reignite the Kurdish issue, because you have Meral Akşener in the coalition, you have the E Party, and they, of course, now have the refugees, the Syrians as their pet hate. But the Kurdish issue might be the cleavage, the material for the cleavage strategy Erdogan will use. And also Alevism might come into the picture if Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu becomes the presidential candidate. I think the AKP propaganda will be playing on sectarian issues, whether it's directly or through the dog whistle, to hint that he is not a real proper Turk. But I think the big point is that, again, this evolution from a party that portrayed itself as a unifying force, bridging those sectarian or ethnic cleavages, trying to articulate the idea of Turkish politics and society, which is inclusive to a force, and especially Erdogan playing on division and exacerbating division to maximize support. I think that this is the short term. Longer term, I hope once Erdogan is gone and you have a return of the opposition or some sort of a rotation in power, that the habits forged during the anti-Erdogan coalition building will sustain themselves, so they won't be, so HDP and other parties will be able to cooperate in the interests of Turkey. But my suspicion is that even in the best case scenario, once the enemy, the rival, Erdogan is gone, there will be a lot of infighting, and all of a sudden some of the achievements of being able to have a broad-based coalition all the way from political Islamists, Sadat, or to the secularists, and all from nationalists all the way to the Kurds, this coalition won't be sustainable longer term. So that's my convoluted answer.
Thank you, Dimo. Not so much convoluted, but incredibly insightful, I'd say. And I'm very unfortunate that I'm not we don't have the time to discuss many more of these questions. But maybe we should start moving on to the question, what is the immediate future? What comes after Erdogan? There was one question by Vasil Sotirov on neo-Ottomanism, but I think you have answered that in your discussion of Islamism. Now, on the future, there are a number of questions by John Artunkal, for instance, on how do you think Erdogan can exit? Will he leave the country for Qatar, or do you think he will try to cling to power even if he loses the elections? Another question is by Cvete Koneska, also an Antonian. What would post-Erdogan Turkey look like in your view? How lasting do you think Erdogan's legacy will be? The question of Erdoganism, and in which areas do you think his legacy will be longer lasting? And by Beshar Gergi, the question, do you think that a liberal, relatively, well, there's no liberal-minded opposition in Turkey, but there's a relatively liberal-minded opposition. If they win the next elections, what would this change? Would Turkey be readmitted to the Western polity? The question is. And I think this is pretty much, there are a few more questions which have been largely answered. So if we can discuss these future prospects, Turkey under Erdogan. It's of course something which probably everybody working on Turkey would like to see happening very soon, even though it may not be happening immediately.
Well, I have a sentence just to start with Svete's question about Erdogan's legacy, sort of. I have a sentence in the epilogue I've been taking some criticism over, which says that in 20 years it will still be Erdogan's Turkey. And people are saying you're too pessimistic, it won't be the case. But just to qualify it a little bit, Erdogan's legacy as a political figure will be a historical symbol, as it were. They'll be part of the political spectrum in Turkey, referring to him and adapting whatever remains from Erdogan to the current day. Think about, I know that this is anathema to secularists to compare Erdogan and Atatürk, but think about Kemalism and how flexible it turned out to be, and depending on the political moment, the reference to Kemalism. And today, of course, is a holiday in Turkey. The 19th of May is also celebrating his memory and youth and sport. But how that was a useful legacy, kind of referred to mobilize political support and shape political discourse. I think something along those lines will happen with Erdogan. He will become a symbol. Other parts of his legacy might not survive. The presidential regime might be reversed, although we don't know. I mean, there's a very vigorous debate now in the opposition to do with who will be the candidate. And there's a school of thought saying that Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul, if he wins the presidency under this scenario, he might actually like the idea of being the next leader. And he went to this trip to Trabzon, to the Black Sea region where he comes from, and where also Erdogan's father came from. They shared that as well. And he was accompanied, so he talked to some people associated with the AKP, prominent opinion makers. So there's this fear that actually the opposition, once stepping in the institutional vestiges established by Erdogan, might actually continue in the same path. So that's certainly a danger. That it won't be just the mythology around Erdogan, but also be the institutional legacy as well at play. Do I think that the military is capable of making interventions? I don't think that's the case. It won't be the arbiter. Although, again, I was wrong in 2016 when people were speculating about the possible military coup attempt by the military. If you ask me in June 2016, I'd say this is ludicrous, right? And then the coup attempts happened all of a sudden. So I was wrong. And whatever I say now that the military is irrelevant, events might disprove me. But that's my strong feeling that they won't be the arbiter. What will be the future? I think some sort of scenario a bit along the lines of Spain. Think about the senescent Franco. He goes down for physical reasons, and then his successors, to stay in power, they have to bargain with the opposition. There is a transition of sorts, which is a classic case shaping democratization literature. I think something along those lines will happen in Turkey. And luckily, Turkey doesn't need to build democracy from scratch. It has a tradition. It was never a perfect democratic system. We all know the problems. But it had competitive elections, high level of participation. So there is a lot of institutional legacy that will be key to Turkey's future. And finally, I need to run in 2 minutes, but Laszlo's question, will Turkey be accepted? Well, Turkey has never really been rejected because it's part of NATO. NATO is essential to Turkish security. And support for NATO, if you look at surveys, is still strong in Turkey. Society knows the value of it. Turkey is part of the EU customs union. It's not part of the normative West. Our friend Galip Dalay, who is at St. Antony's as well, has written beautifully about the distinction, the various images of the West. Turkey is part of the strategic West, maybe the Eurosphere economically, but it's not part of the normative vision. We would rejoin this normative vision. I think it will be not up to the West, it will be up to Turkey and Turkish society to decide.
Thank you, Dimitar. On this note, I think I get vibes from Wouter that we're running out of time. It's almost 3 o'clock here in Venice, 2 o'clock in Oxford. So I think we need to close. Thank you so much for this very generous insight into your work and into the complexity of both the subject matter and your dealing with it. I truly enjoyed the discussion, and I would like to thank the organizers, obviously, and also and especially the participants for their excellent questions. And I'd like to give the word back to whoever wants to take it. Wouter, Roger.
Yeah, so I will say, well, first of all, a big thank you to you both. It was really fantastic, really interesting. So thank you both for making the time. Before you all go, very quickly, I wanted to tell you a little bit about a new initiative at St. Antony's that was taken by our current students, and which will be a priority for us, and that is to raise funds for a new scholarship that is specifically for students from the Global South who did their first degrees in countries that receive official development assistance from the OECD. So again, for students who did their undergraduate degrees, not at European or North American universities, but who did their degrees in the countries where they're from. Anyway, it would be wonderful if you were able to support this new initiative at a level you're comfortable with, and you will hear from me about it soon more. Thank you again all for joining us, and I hope you will be able to visit St. Antony's soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And do buy the book. It's available in all good bookshops.
Do buy the book, definitely. And it's really worth your money.
Available also on Amazon. Dimitar, Kerem, huge thanks. That was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.